G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza, and today we're going to be looking at one of the 12 fundamental principles of animation, that being specifically squash and stretch. And we're going to take a look at some use case examples and talk about why it's so cool and so useful. So we're going to dive into the depths of squash and stretch today. And before we jump into exploring and applying this principle of animation, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Best Fiends. Best Fiends is a free puzzle adventure game where you can collect and build a team of fiends to defeat slugs by matching same coloured objects. The game is completely free and available on all of your mobile platforms. I'll put a link in the description, so make sure to go check that out. Starting today, you can watch the slugs train in the in-app world premiere of their animated short Boot Camp, and then after you check that out, go play the Boot Camp event in-game where you can win massive rewards. And if you download the game now by clicking the link in the description of this video, you will get $5 of free diamonds in the game, allowing you to unlock some awesome goodies in the game. So go check out all that stuff. And the reason I wanted to also open up with the mentioning of their animated short is that the slug characters that they use in this animated short have really cool squash and stretch in their animation, which was actually the inspiration behind making this the theme of the video. I wanted to explore squash and stretch and show how you can apply that principle to your own animations.
Oh yeah, easy peasy.
No, don't dodge the punches, maggot. That's not how we do things.
Slug, yes, slug!
Their slug characters, which you can see here, are a really fun example of a very simplistic but appealing character design which is easy to apply this principle to. And it's often easiest to learn more difficult principles of animation when you apply them to simplistic characters like this. And taking those as inspiration, I made my own character design here of my own military slug, and we're going to take this dude and we're going to apply the principles of squash and stretch that we explore together starting now, but not with this slug. We're actually going to start off by exploring the principles with a ball, because it's, like I say, much easier to explore something really simple to learn the principle and then apply it over time to something slowly more complicated. So this is a ball bouncing without squash and stretch applied. Now, it doesn't look too bad. The motion is reasonably decent, the timing's good, it feels somewhat physical, but let me just swap this out for my orange ball here with squash and stretch applied, and you can see how immediately there's more bounce, there's more life and more character to something as simple looking as a ball. Now if I make both of these frames visible at once and just sort of play through, you can see the positioning is exactly the same with both of these balls. The only thing that is different is the application of the principles squash and stretch. Now I'm going to drag out my onion skin, which shows me the previous frames. Looking at it this way, we can break down the different positions of the ball. These are the stretch frames here, and then with a green, I'll just circle some of the squash frames. Now you'll notice that this last section of frames in here doesn't really have much squash and stretch applied. That's because there's not much speed and acceleration and deceleration in the motion itself. And that is really what squash and stretch is about. It's about something speeding up and immediately slowing down. So if I get rid of this for now and just go back to my red, this arc of motion here with the ball accelerating into the first bounce is being accentuated. The motion is being really overemphasized by stretching the circular shape of that ball into a really elongated ellipse. The other thing that you'll notice, if let's say you slice this visual in half, there are a lot more frames in this second half than there are in the first half, meaning that the amount of time it takes for the ball to bounce and land here is a lot longer than it takes for this ball to initially bounce and bounce back up. To put it simply, the more frames there are in an animation, the longer it takes for that animation to play out. The second half is almost twice as long as the first half because over time we're slowing down as the ball loses its momentum. So to break it down for you nice and simply, we start off by accelerating the ball by stretching that circle shape into an elongated ellipse shape, and then at the first collision point, this stretched shape immediately becomes a squashed shape. Now, there's a reason that squash and stretch are combined into one principle of animation, because squash and stretch nearly always go together. And as you can see here, we have a stretched ball which almost immediately leads into a squash, essentially meaning that we have an acceleration instantly being decelerated because we hit a surface and we're stopped before we then accelerate out. of that into the next bounce. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the energy or the intensity of your accelerations or stretches diminishes over time as that energy dissipates. This all sounds very scientific and fancy, but essentially it means it stretches less the more that something moves and slows down. Now that's all well and good, and we've talked a lot about this bouncing ball for a significant period of time, so let's move on to a practical example where I show you my process in applying this squash and stretch. Now I have here a ball, and we have a funny little platform set up where we have a bit of a ledge, a sort of pit area, and a wall on the other side opposite the ball, and a funny looking golf club. Now I've pre-animated a bit of a golf swing, and we're going to animate the ball bouncing off of the golf club. Now it's worth noting just briefly that I even applied a very little bit of subtle stretch to my golf club here just to show that acceleration of motion in the golf club in the apex of its arc, to really show that it's a very strong momentum, strong motion, and it's almost always effective to apply these stretches in a very fast piece of accelerated motion with your animation. So now going back to our ball, the motion is completely still up until the very moment of collision, whereupon I'm going to create a new keyframe and I'm going to draw a new ball shape. When you're animating, doesn't matter what it is, squash and stretch or complicated characters or simple characters, animation takes place over multiple frames, and it's always effective and helpful to see those previous and upcoming frames. And we use something called the onion skin, which shows those frames previous to the frame that you're working on. So I'm going to turn on my onion skin, and on this collision frame, I'm going to squash my ball because it's being whacked with a significant force. Now, I'm not just squashing it in any shape, it's sort of being squashed into a bean shape wrapped around that golf club head, because the impact of the force is hitting directly in the middle. So I'm squashing it from the middle, which pushes out. Now, it's always helpful to follow something called an arc, or an arc of motion, which is one of the other principles of animation, which we could get into for a different video. But suffice it to say, it's helpful to draw something like this that I can follow in my motion. Going back to my ball frame and I'll wireframe my arc, I'm going to draw a very long, very stretched ball along this arc of motion. Now, if you looked at this out of context, you wouldn't think of it as a ball. You'd think of it as a weirdly long ellipse. But because there's a huge amount of force applied, we're applying a huge amount of stretch. The more acceleration, the stretchier your object or character will be, and with every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, so leading into our squash, that only stands to reason that our squash is going to have a lot more intensity to it as well, because it's reacting against that very intense acceleration. I find it's helpful to not show the stretch touching the collision point pre-collision, essentially meaning don't draw the ball stretched and touching where it's going to hit. Instead, have it just before your collision point, and then on the next frame, have the immediate squash applied. So we can go like this and draw our ball squashing against the wall, and we can test what we've got so far by going back and hitting enter, and that feels pretty good. As you can see, it's really rapid. This is over about 4 frames, pew, we have that big whack and we hit the wall, but I want it to decelerate pretty quickly, and I'm gonna actually go in and draw the next couple of arcs of motion that I'm going to follow, which is going to help me know how to position my ball. So I'm actually going to have it bounce like this, and then one more short bounce like this, and then maybe have a short roll along the ground until it stops. So I'll wireframe and lock that and go back to drawing my ball. The next frame is going to be another squash frame, but it's just going to be less squashy. So I'll bring it closer to its normal shape, but it's still a bit squashed, until on the next frame it'll pop out a bit, somewhat stretched, but nowhere near as stretched as we had the ball before. This time it's much closer to its original size, which you can see here, but just a little stretched out, just slightly elongated. These frames are closer together as the ball has slowed down, so there are more of them. And then we have another squash frame, but again, this squash frame is nowhere near as squashy as our first squash frame after that really heavy impact. So we have a squash frame there, and then we have a little stretch out of that position there, but it actually is going to slowly normalize into the original shape and size of the ball, and it can actually help to just go back to our original ball illustration and then in a new frame paste that and then just use that for the remainder of the animation. You can just hit F6 if you're in most animation programs and apply this multiple times until we have the ball slowing down to a stop. So if I hit enter, you can see our squash and stretch frames all applied to this motion that I've animated for you in front of you, so you can sort of see how I went about it. Now I hope that helps you understand a little bit about that principle of squash and stretch. Now I know what you're thinking, Jazza, it's all well and good when we're talking about a very simple ball. How do we apply this to a more complex looking character like our slug here? Well, that's a good point, and I'm going to break that down for you now, but the short answer is you start off with simplicity and you add the complexity on top. So what do I mean by starting off with simplicity and adding complexity on top? If you looked at this character as a whole and thought to yourself, okay, I'm going to animate something hitting him and him being thrown off of the screen, or on the opposite side of things, have him be thrown into frame and hit a wall and stop immediately, you might think that would be really difficult. And in some ways it is, but in some ways it can be really simplified by breaking down this complex image into a few core elements and basic shapes that you can use to animate the motion with as a foundation and then add the details on top. So what I mean by that is essentially taking this and breaking it down into construction lines. I'll use a nice green slug-like color, and we can break down the construction of our slug into this tall sort of shape. We're actually ignoring the helmet. This is the actual physical body of the slug that I'm creating the construction for, and this will include the eyes. So I'm going to just draw the eyes as two circles and connect that to the head with two lines. Now I will include the mouth as part of the construction because that is a very physical part of this slug's body. So we have the construction of the slug. Then on a new layer, I'm going to select a dark greeny gray, and this will be my helmet, and I'm just tracing around the helmet I've already drawn here. And then I'm going to select a bluish color, and this can be the outfit around the slug. Again, we're not adding details, we're just doing the very rough shapes. And I'm going to hide my original art, and you can see if we look at this as an object to animate, all of a sudden it feels much more simple, particularly if we consider that we can animate them one at a time. We could animate the slug's body first, and then animate the objects, or the helmet and the torso clothing on top of what we've already done. It really simplifies the process. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to hide my helmet and torso clothing, and I'm going to only start off by animating the simple construction of the slug's body. And I'm going to do this as applied to two squash and stretch applications. The first is going to be something I will have coming from the side, probably one of the big boxing gloves like they have in the animated short for the boot camp thing, which is going to hit him and he's going to be thrown off of the screen. So we're going to start off with an immediate squash thrown into an accelerated stretch. That's the first thing we're going to do. And then the second thing we're going to do is almost as if a camera's being changed immediately to when he's thrown into the screen, he'll be stretching and accelerating, and we'll have a simple wall shape or something here, or maybe closer to here so he can land in his original position, where he will collide with this wall, stretch, and then fall back into his original position. And I'll make it so it can loop, so we can see him hit, go off on the right side of the screen, and then come back in on the left side of the screen, collide with a wall and fall into his original position and repeat itself. Now imagine if I described animating all of that and only showed you this. It might seem like a really difficult thing to approach and do, but because we have something so simple to work from, much later on after we've nailed down the physical motion, it's going to be a lot easier and a lot more fun to apply the details. So jumping straight into it, we start off with the frame where there's first contact between our slug and the boxing glove. And it's most easy when you approach this kind of like how we approached the ball earlier. Now obviously it's a little more complex, but at the same time it's infinitely more simple than creating the whole character's artwork at once. By focusing on one simple part of the character's geometry that can more easily be manipulated and warped, squashed and stretched, we get to really concentrate on creating effective motion, which, when it comes to animation, is the most important thing. The details can be tweaked here and there later on, but the most important thing is that what happens looks effective and that it also plays out at a good pace. Once I've finished the slug's body, it's time to move on to adding a few props on a layer above my initial slug's animation, starting off with a helmet which is animated on top, and you can see that there's very little motion in terms of how much it's squashed and stretched. It does change angle and it does sort of move as far as the distance between the helmet and the rest of the body of the slug. Then once I'm happy with how the helmets come together, I move on to adding the torso clothing, which kind of looks like a scarf wrapped around the entirety of the body. So I've finished creating my two animated segments, and I'm going to start off with our first one, which is the slam into the acceleration, or the squash into the stretch. We start off with our character in our first position, and we have this boxing glove. I had it set to showing the outline while I animated, so it wasn't so distracting, but I can show the full boxing glove now, and you can see how the motion of the character wraps around the boxing glove for 2 frames and stretches as the force from the boxing glove is applied to our slug. Then the next frame, our third frame of animation, the stretch begins. And then we go into full stretch mode. Another thing that you'll notice too is that the helmet, which is animated on a different layer, the construction of the helmet at least, doesn't have a huge amount of squash and stretch applied to it. That being said, there is a little bit of squash and stretch, but just a little bit, because that will help demonstrate that while there is physical motion happening and this helmet is still receiving a lot of impact, it differentiates the physical makeup between the helmet and the slug's body, showing that the helmet is very solid and the slug is very squishy. So I'm going to hide the boxing glove and the helmet and clothing and just go through this slug's body here. You can see the first 2 frames of the squash. Again, this is really simple as far as using construction lines to create the motion first, and then we go into the stretch. Now we're going to go into the next part of the animation where we have the slug here coming in from the side and coming to a very abrupt stop. Or, in this case, the stretch into the squash. The stretch, as you can see, is indicating the acceleration, and then the immediate stopping, or the squashing, happens as he hits the wall, and this is another example of the difference in physical makeup between the helmet and his body. You can see his body is really flat against the wall that he hits, and though the helmet has a little bit of squash applied, it really helps to have approached animating these 2 areas of construction separately, because I can focus on the physical makeup of each as they react to the motion that's happening. And then we have another mini squash and stretch into his standing position. So after the squash, there's a little bit of a stretch in this downwards sort of motion, indicating that his center of mass, or the lower part of his body, is heading down in that direction, and the rest of his body is sort of lagging behind, which you can see with the helmet in particular, as it's sort of quite distant from the mouth in this frame, and then when we hit the ground and he squashes again once more, the helmet is all of a sudden much lower and quite on top of the mouth, or very much lower on the head. So everything's sort of been pushed down the helmet onto his body and his body into the ground. And then after that we have 5 or 6 frames which return to his normal standing position. And this is where we normalize from that final squash and it sort of just releases into his standing pose. Now I will remind you that it always helps to work towards something, and because I wanted this to be looped, I worked towards looping back to that original first frame. So I used my onion skin to make sure I was getting closer and closer, so that after this final squash he released into that final standing position. And then the result is we have this loop where we have a standing slug being smacked with a glove, and then he comes in from the side, hits the wall and stops. And we can play this again and again to our own delight, which is super fun. But the cool part is, now that we've finished the motion, we can add the embellishments and the details and the final outlines of our character on top of these construction lines. Now, this is still a time-consuming process and takes a little bit of practice to get used to, but by breaking it up into the construction stage and animating the different physicalities separate from one another in the context of the same motion, all of a sudden adding the outline of the character is pretty straightforward. This is going to be time consuming, so I'll speed up through the process. The last thing I will point out, of course, is that it's very useful to have everything wireframed as you create the animation of the final outline of the character. Essentially meaning that as you work on the thick black lines of the character, everything except for that character, including our construction reference, is made into these very thin wireframes that we can see and use as a reference, but don't create too much visual confusion. Now moving on to the line work, this bit is a bit of fun. It can be a little bit visually confusing when you have all of those references that you're looking at, but you do get used to that over time. Basically, you want to focus on the layers that indicate where you're currently drawing and just reference the previous frame or the onion skin layer just to make sure that your proportions and details are in the right place. If you want a little bit of less visual confusion, you can turn off the onion skin and just use the wireframe of the current frame as your template, and then simply flick back and forward between the previously drawn frame and the current frame. This creates a similar effect as page rocking back and forth, like the old school Disney animators used to do, flicking the pages back and forth so they can see the motion take place. This helps both to make sure that the motion is happening well and also that the proportions are maintained and that the details are all where they should be. Another thing to help when approaching something that can be a little more visually confusing, like the full line work of a character, is to focus on segments at a time. And in particular, I found it really helpful to focus on the helmet and the eyes first, and then to create the body coming out of that. And if you can do that, if you can focus on small portions and create those segments of the character effectively and then move on to other portions of the character, you'll find that you'll surprise yourself how quickly a complicated looking pose or position can come together in a way that, when attacked in smaller portions, didn't actually seem that difficult to do. When I reach the frame which is the apex of the stretch, or the most stretched the slug character becomes, that is essentially the first half of my animation task completed. And so what I did is I actually went back to my initial references and I picked out some of the colors of my initial slug reference characters, particularly the helmet, the skin tone, and a leather brown. And then I applied these single colors to my slug that I then applied to the rest of the frames of my slug character, or at least the set of frames in the first half of the animation. The reason I did that is because I actually wanted to recycle the most stretched frame and copy and paste that, and it's most easily done if it's fully colored in and finished, so that you can copy and paste it and then move it around frames without needing to color it in multiple times. You only need to color it in once, and then you can copy and paste it to your heart's content without having to do more work. It's little time-saving tricks and tidbits like this that, when you're animating longer pieces of animation, save your sanity. So just keep little things like that in mind, because efficiency is key, especially when you get into animating more complex scenes than this. Now we're moving on to the second half of our sequence of animation, this time going from the stretch into the squash, and you can see that the first 3 frames are just copy and pasted from the most stretched out illustration of the earlier sequence. Then we create our first raw illustration in this next sequence with the frames where the slug character has collided with the wall. Once again, I'll point out that I did use the helmet and the eyes as a bit of an anchor for my focus as far as helping save my confusion from the detail that I was looking at, but also I find, particularly when I'm focusing on squashing and stretching, you can use a few key indicators to help you effectively accentuate this. For example, when fully stretched, the helmet tends to be further away from the body and the eyes flailing at a distance, and then when squashed, the helmet and the eyes all seem to smoosh into the mass of the body. The frames after the final squash, when he lands and then returns to his normal position, are pretty subtle in terms of the transformation. We're just essentially releasing him from the intense squash and stretch motions that he's been tolerating. So the frames are pretty close together, and we're essentially using the first frame of our whole animation as our last frame and a bit of an anchor or reference, which we're slowly working towards returning to. And here we have the finished result of my animation. I'll play it through a couple of times so you can see how the squash and stretch really accentuate the motion. I'm going to rewind it here and play through frame by frame a bit, just so you can see slowly how we went about this. So as we can see, we have the boxing glove coming in here, and on the first frame of impact, we have this massive squash around the boxing glove shape. Now it is slightly incremental, so we start off a little bit squishy and then the next frame is much more squashed. And then the frame following that, when the slug separates from the boxing glove which hit it, the stretching starts to take place. Now obviously there isn't much of this shown on screen because it happens all very quickly. But I guess at the end of the day, that's kind of the point of squash and stretch. It helps communicate intensity and motion when you have often very few frames to do that effectively. And then finally we have the second half of our animation, and as you can see, I've just essentially copied and pasted that stretch frame that I used before. Again, this stuff happens so quickly that you can recycle things here and there just to make your job easier, because animation is pretty time consuming on the best of days. And then as soon as we have that collision, everything sort of squashes up here, and the helmet, as I mentioned before, has less of the squash impact than the body has. And then the motion follows through. We have a bit of a stretch falling down into that downwards motion until we have one final squash, followed by a very slow rebound into our final standing position. And this enables us to loop it forever. And this slug likes to take a beating, it seems, because after every single hit, he's just as happy as he was before. Thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed this video and that the principles and the techniques we went into in this video are helpful for you and your animation projects. Once again, a huge thank you to the sponsor, Best Fiends. Make sure to check out their game. It's free to download and play. And of course, you can check out the animation that they made, the Best Fiends Bootcamp animation, which, like I said, is a really great example of physical intensity in animation. So make sure to check out the link in the description to visit the sponsor, check out the animation, the game, and get your $5 of free diamonds for your own in-game goodies that you can use today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't. We're here on Draw with Jazza. We have animation and art, games, tutorials, and challenges all the time. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.
Make sure to subscribe to my channel to see more of my videos. And while you're at it, check out my shop where I sell ebooks, brushes, photo references, video courses, and more. There's another video you might enjoy from my channel over there, and you can also check out my behind the scenes daily vlog channel, Daily Jazza. That's it for now, and until next time, I'll see you later.